What happens when a Hollywood legend decides she's had enough of being interrupted and finally talks back to one of daytime television's most outspoken hosts? On a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning on The View, viewers were about to witness one of the most brutal verbal takedowns in the show's history as Fonda absolutely dismantled Joy Behar live on national television. The clash was so intense that it left the entire studio in stunned silence, and by the end, Joy Behar looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. The cameras were rolling, the audience settled in their seats, and the hosts were preparing to welcome their guest for the day, the legendary Jane Fonda. At 86 years old, Fonda had experienced every facet of Hollywood from her early days as a rising star to her transformation into a celebrated activist and fitness icon. She had come to discuss her latest project, but nobody anticipated that the conversation would turn into a personal confrontation. Asterisk, as Jane walked onto the set, the audience erupted in applause. She looked elegant in a crisp white blazer, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her posture radiated the confidence of someone who had spent over 6 decades in the spotlight, settling gracefully into the guest chair. She was greeted warmly by Whoopi Goldberg, who said, "Welcome back to The View. Jane, it's always such a pleasure to have you here." Jane smiled, replying, "Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be back." Before she could even get comfortable, however, Joy Behar jumped in with her trademark bluntness, immediately challenging Jane about her climate activism. Asterisk, so Jane, I have to ask you about something that's been bothering me. You've been very vocal about climate change and activism, but don't you think it's a bit hypocritical coming from someone who spent decades flying around in private jets and living in massive mansions? The question hung heavy in the air, and the other hosts exchanged uneasy glances. Jane's expression shifted slightly, but she remained composed. "Well, Joy, I think that's an interesting way to start an interview," she replied steadily, with a subtle edge signaling she wouldn't be pushed around. "I've been transparent about my past and the changes I've made in my lifestyle. I've reduced my carbon footprint significantly and used my platform to raise awareness about climate issues." Asterisk. Joy, clearly unsatisfied, leaned forward, her voice growing louder. "But come on, Jane. You can't just say you've changed and expect everyone to forget about your lavish lifestyle. You're telling regular people to make sacrifices while you live in luxury. Don't you see the problem with that?" The audience murmured as tension thickened. Jane's eyes narrowed, revealing the fire that had made her a formidable presence both on screen and in activism. "Joy, I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here," Jane said, her voice calm but firm. "Are you interviewing me about my current work, or are you trying to create drama for your show? Because if it's the latter, I think you're going about it the wrong way." Asterisk. Joy's face flushed red, caught off guard by Jane's directness. "I'm just asking the questions that viewers want answered. I'm being honest here." But Jane cut her off, her voice gaining strength. "No, Joy, you're being rude and confrontational. There's a difference between honest journalism and what you're doing right now." The other hosts sat frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Whoopi Goldberg appeared ready to step in, while the others fidgeted nervously. Feeling cornered, Joy attempted to double down. "I'm sorry if you can't handle tough questions, Jane, but this is The View. We don't do softball interviews here." Asterisk. That comment was the spark that ignited Jane Fonda's full fury. She sat up straighter, her eyes blazing with intensity, reminding everyone why she had always commanded attention on screen. "Tough questions." Jane's voice cut sharply through the air. "Joy, you call that journalism? You ambushed me with poorly researched accusations without giving me a chance to respond properly. That's not tough journalism. That's tabloid sensationalism." The studio fell silent, the air thick with the undeniable clash of two strong personalities, one refusing to be intimidated, the other struggling to regain control of the conversation. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Jane wasn't finished. And furthermore, she continued, if you had done even basic research before this interview, you would know that I've been living in a smaller home for years. I've eliminated private jet travel from my personal life, and I've donated millions to environmental causes. But you didn't bother to check any of that, did you? The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Joy Behar looked genuinely shocked that Jane Fonda was fighting back so forcefully. She stammered for a moment, trying to regain control of the conversation. Well, I think our viewers deserve to know about these contradictions, she said weakly, but her confidence was clearly shaken. Jane leaned back slightly in her chair, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. What our viewers deserve, Joy, is honest, respectful dialogue, not whatever this performance is supposed to be. The word performance hit Joy like a slap. Her face went from red to pale in seconds as she glanced around the table, searching for support from her co-hosts. But they all avoided eye contact, leaving her to face Jane Fonda's wrath alone. I don't know what you're implying, Joy said, her voice rising defensively. I'm not implying anything, Jane replied, coolly. I'm stating it directly. You're performing right now, trying to create conflict where none needs to exist. It's beneath both of us. Joy was rattled. She had entered the interview thinking she could intimidate the Hollywood icon, but instead, she was being systematically dismantled by someone who had spent decades dealing with far tougher opponents than a daytime talk show host. Look, Jane, Joy tried again. I'm just trying to hold you accountable for your actions. Jane let out a small, condescending laugh. Hold me accountable, Joy. You're a talk show host, not a prosecutor. And even if you were, you'd need your facts straight before making accusations. The tension in the studio was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. As the cameras captured every moment of Joy Behar's humiliation, Whoopi Goldberg finally decided to step in. Sensing that Joy was drowning and the interview was spiraling out of control. Maybe we should move on to talking about your new project, Jane, she suggested. But Joy, now desperate to save face, made the worst possible decision. Instead of taking the lifeline Whoopi offered, she doubled down. No, wait, Joy said, holding up her hand. I think we need to address this properly, Jane. You've made a career out of being controversial. From your time in Vietnam to your various political stances, you've never shied away from stirring the pot. So why are you so sensitive now when someone questions you? The audacity of that statement left the studio speechless for a moment. Jane's expression shifted from annoyed to genuinely angry. She had been attempting to keep the conversation civil, but Joy had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Sensitivities. Jane's voice was dangerously quiet. Joy, you clearly don't understand the difference between being controversial and being ignorant. What you just said proves you have no idea what you're talking about. Emboldened by what she mistakenly thought was momentum, Joy pressed forward. I'm talking about your anti-war protests, your comments about American soldiers. You can't just rewrite history, Jane. The studio fell completely silent. Even the crew behind the cameras seemed to stop moving. Jane sat perfectly still for a moment, then spoke with a steel edge in her voice that could have cut glass. Joy, I'm going to give you one chance to retract that statement and apologize. Because what you just said is not only factually incorrect, it's deliberately inflammatory and disrespectful to both me and to the veterans I've worked with for decades. But Joy, in her arrogance and desperation, made another catastrophic mistake. I don't need to apologize for stating facts. Your actions during Vietnam are well documented, she retorted. Jane rose slowly from her chair, the possibility of walking off the set flashing briefly across the room. Instead, she turned to face Joy directly, her presence commanding the room. Facts, Jane said, her voice controlled but deadly serious. Let me give you some facts, Joy. Asterisk, I spent 2 years visiting wounded veterans in hospitals. Jane Fonda began, her voice measured but firm. I've worked with veteran organizations for over 50 years. I've apologized repeatedly for any pain my actions caused. And I've dedicated significant portions of my life to supporting our troops. But you wouldn't know any of that because you didn't bother to research before you opened your mouth. Joy Behar's face went completely pale as she realized she had stepped into quicksand. Yet instead of stopping, she continued struggling and making it worse. Well, that may be true, but the perception is still there, Joy stammered. The perception. Jane's eyebrows shot up. Joy, you're not reporting on perception. You're creating it. You're spreading misinformation and then hiding behind the excuse that it's what people think. Sarah Haynes finally found her voice, suggesting maybe we should take a commercial break. But Jane held up her hand. No, I think we should finish this conversation. Joy started it, so let's see it through. Joy looked like a deer caught in headlights. She had expected Jane to be an easy target, an elderly actress who would crumble under aggressive questioning. But instead, she had awakened a force of nature, systematically dismantling her credibility in front of millions of viewers. Joy, Jane continued, you have a platform that reaches millions of people every day. With that platform comes responsibility. You can't just throw around accusations and half-truths because you think it makes for good television. Asterisk, I wasn't throwing around accusations. Joy protested weakly. Yes, you were, Jane shot back immediately. From the moment I sat down, you've been making statements without basis, asking loaded questions, and now you're trying to relitigate history you clearly don't understand. This isn't journalism, Joy. This is a hit job. The other hosts looked mortified. One stared at her hands, clearly uncomfortable, while Whoopi appeared to be calculating how to end the disaster, and Sarah seemed frozen in shock. Joy, now completely out of her depth, tried one final desperate move. I think you're overreacting, Jane. This is just a normal interview. That comment was the final straw. Jane let out a laugh, full of disbelief. Normal? Joy. In a normal interview, the host prepares by researching their guest. They ask thoughtful questions designed to inform their audience. They listen to the answers and follow up appropriately. Asterisk, you've done none of that, Jane continued, cutting through Joy's weak protest. If you had prepared, you would know that I've spent the last decade working on climate documentaries. That I've been arrested multiple times protesting environmental destruction, and that I've put my money where my mouth is by funding renewable energy projects. But instead of asking me about meaningful work, you chose to ambush me with tabloid-level gossip. Joy's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She had no response because Jane was absolutely frightened. Everyone in the studio knew it. And another thing, Jane pressed on, her voice gaining momentum. Your approach isn't just unprofessional, it's lazy. You could have had a fascinating conversation about the intersection of entertainment and activism, about how Hollywood has changed over the decades, about the challenges facing older women in the industry. Instead, you chose to create fake controversy because you think conflict equals good television. Asterisk, the audience was completely silent. Some nodding in agreement with Jane. Others visibly uncomfortable witnessing such a thorough professional dismantling. Joy finally managed to whisper a response, barely audible, but Jane cut her off immediately. No, Joy. You were trying to score cheap points at my expense. There's a huge difference. The weight of Jane Fonda's words settled over the studio like a heavy blanket. Joy looked smaller, somehow deflated and defeated. She had started this interview thinking she could expose hypocrisy. But instead, she had exposed her own lack of preparation and professionalism. Jane leaned forward slightly, clearly not finished with her critique. The way you've conducted this interview says more about you than it does about me. She concluded, leaving the studio in stunned silence. Jane Fonda leaned back slightly, her gaze unwavering. "The way you've conducted this interview says more about you than it does about me," she said. "You've shown your viewers that you're more interested in creating drama than in having meaningful conversations with your guests." Joy tried once more to defend herself. But Jane tilted her head slightly, a gesture, both elegant and condescending. "Joy, there's a difference between tough questions and rude behavior," she continued. "Tough questions are well-researched, relevant, and asked with respect. What you've been doing is just being combative for the sake of being combative." The silence that followed was deafening. Joy sat frozen, clearly struggling to process that she had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by her guest. But Jane wasn't finished. Drawing on decades of experience navigating hostile interviews, difficult directors, and challenging situations, she delivered a final blow that would end the confrontation once and for all. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Joy?" Jane said, her voice calm but steeled. "You had an opportunity to have a real conversation with someone who has lived through 7 decades of American history, who has seen the entertainment industry evolve, and who has been on the front lines of social movements. Instead, you chose to waste everyone's time with this performance." Joy's face drained of color as she looked around the table, but her co-hosts were all avoiding eye contact. She whispered, "I think maybe we should move on," but Jane's eyebrow arched sharply. "Oh, now you want to move on? After you've spent the last 10 minutes making accusations and spreading misinformation. That's very convenient, Joy." The audience was riveted. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. It was a masterclass in handling a hostile interviewer. Jane was systematically dismantling everything Joy had tried to accomplish, doing so with the grace and precision of someone who had faced far more formidable challenges. Joy, let me ask you something. Jane leaned forward. When you were preparing for this interview, what exactly did you hope to accomplish? Did you think you were going to expose some great hypocrisy? Did you think I would crumble under your questioning? What was your endgame here? Joy opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Jane pressed on. "From where I'm sitting, it looks like you invited me on your show not to have a conversation, but to use me as a prop in whatever narrative you had already decided to tell your viewers. That's not journalism, Joy. That's exploitation." The word hung in the air like a bomb. Joy's hands shook as she tried to respond. "I never intended to. She stammered, but Jane cut her off gently but firmly. "Joy, I want you to listen very carefully. I've been doing interviews for over 60 years. I've faced hostile journalists, aggressive prosecutors, angry protesters, and difficult studio executives. You are none of those things. You're just a talk show host who thought she could score points by being rude to an elderly guest. And that's not just unprofessional, it's sad." The audience gasped audibly. Joy looked like she had been physically struck. Whoopi Goldberg finally stepped in, suggesting they wrap up, but Jane held up her hand. "Actually, Whoopi, I'd like to finish this thought. Joy started this conversation, and she deserves to hear my complete response." Joy sank lower in her chair, but Jane wasn't letting her off the hook. "Joy, you mentioned that I've been controversial throughout my career. You're right, but there's a difference between being controversial for something you believe in, and being controversial because you don't know how to conduct yourself professionally. When I protested the Vietnam War, spoke out about women's rights, and fought for environmental causes, I knew I would face criticism. I was prepared because I believed in what I was doing. What you've done today isn't brave or principled. You've just been rude because you thought it would make entertaining television." Joy finally whispered, "I'm sorry if you feel I was rude." Jane replied immediately, her tone cutting yet precise. "I don't feel you were rude, Joy. You were rude." That's not a feeling, that's a fact. Your apology would be more meaningful if you actually understood what you were apologizing for. She continued, her voice now calm but firm, as if teaching a student who had badly misbehaved. The next time you have a guest on this show, treat them with respect. Ask questions designed to inform your audience rather than create conflict. Listen to their answers instead of waiting for your next opportunity to attack. And most importantly, remember your guests are human beings, not punching bags for whatever frustrations you're carrying. We come on shows like this to have conversations, to share our experiences, to connect with audiences, not to be ambushed by hosts who haven't done their homework. Asterisk, the studio was eerily quiet, the hum of the cameras audible. Jane Fonda sat back, having delivered one of the most thorough and devastating takedowns in daytime television history. Joy Behar looked utterly destroyed, her earlier confidence replaced by humiliation and regret. Jane's final words were delivered with a slight, controlled smile. Now, would you like to ask me about my actual work, or should I assume this interview is over? Joy glanced helplessly around the table, finding no support from her co-hosts. She muttered, "I think we should go to commercial," and Jane stood gracefully, smoothing her blazer. "That's probably for the best. Thank you for having me, and I hope you'll consider what I've said today." As the cameras cut away and the studio lights dimmed, Joy sat alone, visibly defeated. She had entered the interview hoping to expose Jane Fonda, but instead had exposed herself unprepared, unprofessional, and completely out of her depth against a true Hollywood legend who refused to be intimidated. The audience filed out in stunned silence, many shaking their heads, knowing they had witnessed one of the most brutal interview takedowns in television history.